Nobody can write a book about Americans in the Spanish Civil War and leave out Ernest Hemingway. He hogs so much space in every scene that he's in. Always managed to be the center of attention. But I always like to try to bring people, bring readers characters who will be less familiar to them. So when I went sort of assembling the cast, holding a casting call, so to speak, for this last book of mine, something that always pushed an interesting character to the head of the line was that I hadn't encountered him in another book. I'd come across him or her through something else I was reading, through some papers or diaries or something that I came across. It's just, it always gives me great pleasure when I can add somebody to the network who's not somebody whom you, the reader, are likely to have heard of, even if this is a subject that you read a lot about. Sometimes that means looking for people who have been noticed or discovered only recently. For example, one example from the Spain book, I think the character whom I'm most pleased with discovering is a 19-year-old American woman named Lois Orr, who was in Europe on her honeymoon when the Spanish Civil War began, and insisted to her somewhat older, somewhat stodgier husband that they go to Spain and see this war and see the widespread popular revolution that had taken place in part of Spain, northeastern Spain, see it firsthand. And they walked across the border 2 months after the war began, lived and worked in Barcelona for the next 10 months, got to know George Orwell and his wife when they were there. Extraordinary people. I discovered her by accident because I walked into the archives at the Hoover Institution in Stanford looking for the papers of somebody else entirely. And the woman behind the desk asked me what I was looking for, and I told her, and she said, "So you're working on the Spanish Civil War?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Oh, we have an archivist here who specializes in that. Let me get him." So she called this guy out of the back room, and he said, "Have you ever heard of Lois Orr?" And I said, "No." And he explained. It sounded fascinating. He said they had an unpublished manuscript of hers, and he also referred me to a book of her letters, which had been recently published and has never been reviewed in a single American newspaper, magazine, or academic journal, I discovered. And I was off and running. So this was somebody who very kindly gave me a character, and I'm immensely grateful to him. So it's always fun when you can construct a network using people that are not going to be familiar to your readers. I think the constructed network I had most fun putting together was for a book called To End All Wars, which is about the First World War. And in it, I focused particularly on the experience of that war in Britain, because Britain had the strongest anti-war movement. And I was very interested in trying to retell the story of this war through portraying it not as a battle between two sides, you know, the Allies and the Central Powers, but as a battle, and this battle took place in all of the belligerent countries, between people who thought the war was a noble and necessary crusade and people who thought it was absolute madness and who refused to fight, or who supported those who refused to fight. And that battle was more intense in Britain than anywhere else, so Britain was my focus. Well, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of books about Britain and the First World War, and there is no sort of natural network of characters who immediately emerges. And I wasn't sure how to do this, but I knew that it was this struggle between the wars the war enthusiasts and the war opponents that I wanted to dramatize. I couldn't for the longest time figure out how to tell that story until one day I was reading a very boringly written scholarly article about a prominent British woman pacifist named Charlotte Despard. Flaming radical on every issue of the day, favored independence for India, independence for Ireland, went to jail 4 times in the battle for women's suffrage, later became a founder of the British Communist Party, and during the First World War was a staunch opponent of the war, traveled up and down the country speaking against it. Her rallies were often shut down by rock-throwing mobs or banned by the police. And in this article, the writer, in one sentence in passing, said something like, naturally, Mrs. Despard's activities were deeply distressing to her brother. And it gave his name, Sir John French, which I immediately recognized as British Commander-in-Chief on the Western Front. So I thought, that's going to be an interesting pair to write about. And then I realized that's the way to tell the story of this book, through divided families. If I'm trying to dramatize, the fight over whether people thought this war was worth fighting or not, what better way to tell the story through looking at some families that were divided? So I found 2 other such families. One was this remarkable brother and sister pair who amazingly remained friends and in touch through most of the war. Found another family that some of you are probably familiar with, the famous Pankhurst family of women's suffrage activists, where the mother, Emmeline Pankhurst, and one of her daughters, Christabel, became staunch pro-war patriots, and another daughter, Sylvia, became a leader of the anti-war forces in Britain. And then a third sort of family grouping, a quite powerful, sinister man who was really the number 2 person in the British cabinet for the latter part of the war, Alfred Milner, who had a godson, and Milner was a cabinet minister in charge of coordinating the war effort, had a godson who was not only in jail as a conscientious objector, but was in solitary confinement for refusing to obey prison rules. And there's some other people in that particular family network too. So I decided to construct the book around these 3 divided families or divided family groups, and to bring whatever other characters I brought in to have them connected to one or the other of these families, which was not hard to do. For example, one of the groups of characters that I was particularly interested in, wanted to bring into the story, was a family of anti-war activists in the city of Derby, a family named Wealden, where a mother, her daughter, her son-in-law were all sent to jail on totally trumped-up charges, allegedly plotting to assassinate the prime minister, which was complete nonsense. But they were anti-war, and the government wanted to get them and make an example of them. And it's a particularly fascinating case because Scotland Yard kept all the letters that this family wrote. They seized them and copied them in the mail. They kept letters that were sent from prison. And they infiltrated an informer into this family, which reported on their activities, and his reports are in the files. But I could connect them to one of my 3 central groups of characters in the book, because all of these intelligence reports on the Wealden family flowed across the desk of Alfred Milner, the cabinet minister, and it was indeed in his papers that I was able to read these intelligence reports. So that's an example of what I mean by sort of constructing a network through which to try to bring alive a particular patch of history. And as I say, you know, the rules are you can't make up anything. It all has to be there. You have to find the letters or the diary entries or the other documents or whatever that allow you to say what these people were thinking and feeling about each other and so on. But it can be done, and I love doing that kind of construction. So I think, you know, if you have some good scenes and you've got a good network of characters and you have a patch of history that is filled with drama and tragedy and meaning, a book practically writes itself. You've got the essential ingredients right there, and those are the ingredients that I look for. So why don't I stop right here, and I would be glad to hear your comments or questions. And I know I'm supposed to repeat them into the microphone so that the recording picks them up. Yeah.
I was curious if the family of Ms. Borg contacted you at all, or anybody.
The family of?
Ms. Borg, was that a name, Borg, in the Spanish book of the...
Oh, Lois, yeah. The question was, did the family of Lois Orr contact me? I contacted them. Actually, one of the enjoyable things for me about writing the Spain book was that the Spanish Civil War was recent enough historically so that the children of many of the people who are in the book are alive, and I contacted a great many of them. I met Lois Orr's daughter. She very kindly sent me some additional papers and so on. I met the children of a number of other people in the book, and one or two of them have turned up unexpectedly when I've given presentations of the book at a bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There, sitting in the front row, was the son of one of those two guys who swam across the river in the opening scene. So it's wonderful fun when you can sort of have that kind of connection with people who've lived through part of the story. I also had the pleasure of knowing half a dozen American veterans of the Spanish Civil War. None of them are actually in the book. They're all dead now. They were all people 30 or 40 years older than me, but it was partly through listening to their stories that I first began to get interested in that piece of history. Yeah.
A lot of people are throwing around the term fascism, and I'm curious, given your knowledge of this war, is that an accurate use of the word, or is it an inaccurate periodization? What relationship to fascism then do we have now?
So the question is, are we today again going through a period of fascism as we saw in the 1930s? I would say yes and no. I think obviously in the 30s it was carried to great extremes like the Holocaust, which I certainly hope are not in store for us today. And the fascism of the 1930s, as we knew it in different variations in Germany and Italy and Spain and in much of Eastern Europe, involved a total suppression of all dissent. And much as Donald Trump would like to do that in the United States, I don't think he's going to be able to get away with it. However, I do see a lot of uncomfortable similarities between the kind of demagoguery we see today, you know, not just in Trump, but in his counterparts, you know, Putin in Russia and Erdogan in Turkey, and figures who may be on the horizon like Marine Le Pen in France. I see a lot of very uncomfortable parallels to things that happened in the 1930s. Here are some of them. First, I think that all of these folks, then and now, have one thing in common, which is the idea of a strong man. Put your trust in me, a strong man. Don't worry about the details. Whatever the problem, I'll fix it and it'll be terrific. Second thing is anything that goes wrong is the fault of some outgroup. You know, for Hitler, famously, it was, of course, the Jews. For some of these people in Europe, it's refugees from Syria, it's refugees crossing the Mediterranean. You know, for Trump, sometimes it's Muslims, sometimes it's Mexicans. It's always easy to blame all a country's problems on some outgroup like that. A third thing I think the demagogues then and now have in common is the idea of harking back to some imagined golden age in the past. You know, make America great again. To me is an echo of Mussolini recalling the glories of the Roman Empire, Hitler wanting to restore Germany to its period of dominance pre-1914. Franco always talked about the glories of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, was always a little bit foggy about how that was ever going to be restored. There's always this harking back to the imagined past, which of course, when you look at it carefully, often turns out not to be so great after all, especially for women, colonized people, people of color, and so forth. The wonderful Polish writer Ryszard Kapuscinski talks about the appeal that such demagogues make to the idea of the great yesterday. So I hear that note being struck around the world today as we heard it in the 1930s. And finally, I think something that almost all of these folks have in common is that in that great yesterday, women knew their place. They didn't run for office. They didn't take jobs away from men that rightfully belonged to men, and so forth. So those are some of the commonalities I see between then and there, but I hope we're not at full-fledged fascism yet. Yeah.
So one of your main themes of the Spain book are how journalists miss the very big story of social change in the Republic. Were there similar cases that you found in the other books that you wrote of journalists missing such a big story?
The question was, in Spain, in the Spain book, one of the things I wrote about was how journalists missed the story of what was going on. And was that true in some of these other cases? Yes, it certainly was. This is something that fascinates me because I've worked as a journalist myself. I've done quite a bit of reporting from overseas and sometimes from conflict zones. And what I've always noticed in such places is that reporters practice a certain kind of herd behavior. They stick together because they don't want to get a message from home saying, you know, the other newspaper or the other radio network has reported this or that, and why haven't we heard anything about it from you? The classic example of this for me was I was doing some magazine pieces from South Africa in the mid-1980s, and at one point there had just been a dreadful police killing of about 70 people in Johannesburg, and there was a huge mass funeral at a big soccer stadium. And I went there, and I saw that the press was all clustered together at the near the just below the stage where the ceremony was going to take place, and the foreign press was sort of at the center of the group, and among them many American reporters. And at the very center of the group, I saw the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times correspondents talking to each other, and I sort of edged up to hear what they were saying to each other. They were trying to agree on an estimate for the size of the crowd, so they would all use the same figure in their pieces. So experiences like that made me wonder, in writing about Spain, what stories did the journalists on the scene, of whom there were hundreds, nearly 1,000 foreign correspondents at one time or another reported from Spain during the war. The New York Times had people on both sides throughout the war, other newspapers the same thing, and there were some huge stories they missed. One was that there was an extraordinary social revolution going on in northeastern Spain for the first 6 or 8 months of the war. Workers took over factories, landless peasants took over estates, locomotive drivers took over the railway system, trolley car drivers took over the urban transit system, the waiters of the Hotel Ritz in Barcelona took over the dining room and turned it into People's Cafeteria #1 for the poor. None of the foreign correspondents bothered to write about this. They were all trying to keep up with each other, reporting the siege of Madrid. Another big story that they missed is they never realized that the major supplier of oil to Franco and his nationalists was an American oil company, Texaco, in violation of US law. Now, this was a story, admittedly, that would have been hard to get on the ground in Spain, but you would at least think that the reporters who for months were being bombed by Nazi bombers in Madrid and Barcelona and other cities might send a message home to their editors saying, we're getting bombed every night by German planes. They seem to have plenty of aviation gasoline. Germany is an oil importer and not an oil exporter. Where's that oil coming from? Couldn't you look into it? Because the United States was the world's major source of oil at that point. And in other cases, I think, even though journalism is a great profession, and I teach at the Graduate School of Journalism, journalists often miss the story when they practice too much herd behavior. For example, in the story of King Leopold's Congo, which became famous for its slave labor system and the enormous atrocities that took place there, that didn't really hit the world's front pages until around 1903, 1904. In 1898, 36 Belgian reporters were taken to the Congo at King Leopold's expense to cover the opening of a railway that he built there. And none of them seem to have noticed that the railway had been built by forced laborers. Other observers were more observant. Joseph Conrad, when he went to the Congo in 1890, watched some of those early builders of the railroad and noticed that as he walked over the route where the railroad was being built, there were men with chains around their necks. And he wrote about it in his diary, and something of the spirit of what he found there found its way into Heart of Darkness. So, yeah, I think reporters always have missed the story. Sometimes they miss it because of censorship. During the First World War, for example, there was almost no coverage of the anti-war movement in Britain, or indeed very little of what there was happening in the United States. Britain was under kind of strict wartime censorship, which made that prohibited. How many journalists would have liked to have covered that if they could? I don't know. But some small independent papers, some particular issues of which were suppressed, did cover those things. Yeah.
How does your experience in journalism inform or influence how you write history?
Has my experience in journalism informed how I write history? I think yes, for this reason, that I spent nearly 10 years as a magazine editor, first at Ramparts Magazine and then at Mother Jones. And one of the things you're doing as a magazine editor is, first of all, you try to make sure that everything you publish is scrupulously accurate. If it's a good magazine, it has a fact-checking department where every writer has to produce his or her source for each piece of data, fact, statistic, or whatever, because you get sued if it's wrong. But the other thing a magazine editor has to do that I've found relevant is all of the time you're thinking, how can I get this writer to rewrite, cut or expand his or her story in order to make it appeal to people, because you know very quickly what people are reading. These days, you know disastrously quickly because you can count the number of clicks online. Happily, that wasn't in effect in my magazine editing days. But, you know, working with a group of intelligent colleagues trying to make those judgments about every story we were considering publishing. Does it work at this length? Is this a 5,000-word story when it really only deserves to be a 2,000-word story, or the other way around? Would this story be more effective if it was centered on a profile of somebody? How could this story, how could the writer work more suspense into the story? Dealing with those questions every day about how to make things appeal to readers, I thought was very useful training for me. And it also, how can I put it? It sort of de-romanticizes your own writing, because all too often I think we tend to assume that anything we write, you know, is per se deserves to be published and read by the widest possible audience and so on. And when you have to bring anything that you write before, you know, a committee of 4 or 5 other editors and defend it and accept their criticisms and so on, and maybe the story goes through 3 or 4 rewrites before it's published, it's very humbling. So I think it was good training for me, and it made me think long and hard about how to tell a story in a way that will reach people. Yeah.
What is your opinion of Hemingway as a writer, as a man, and as a political animal?
What's my opinion of Hemingway as a writer, as a man, as a political animal? A great writer, a thoroughly obnoxious human being, and politically interesting in this sense. I think that, you know, he was somebody who was sort of studiously non-political until the Spanish Civil War began. In fact, he hadn't even bothered to vote in the 1936 presidential election. And he'd certainly never engaged himself in politics or written about politics. But Spain was a country he cared about passionately. He'd spent a lot of time in. The novel that really first made him famous, The Sun Also Rises, which I think is probably his best novel, was based on a trip to Spain. He'd returned there to write a book about Spanish bullfighting. He had a lot of friends there. And when General Franco staged an uprising against Spain's government, Hemingway sort of took it as a personal affront. And he was very eager to go to Spain to cover the war. He was too old to fight, but he reached an agreement with this newspaper syndicate, the North American Newspaper Alliance, to write articles from the war, and made 4 long trips to Spain during the war, several months each. I think his articles are not great journalism. Some of them are very vivid, very well written, but he was very much at pains not to say anything in print that would harm the cause of the Spanish Republic. And there was a lot that could be said in print that would have harmed the cause of the Republic. In the latter part of the war, you know, anybody writing honestly about it would have to acknowledge the Republic was losing, and losing badly. In the earlier part of the war, anyone writing honestly about it would have to say this was a country, a government that was riven by factions, something which actually broke out into open street fighting in which several hundred people were killed in Barcelona, May 1937. George Orwell, who was in that street fighting, took part in it and wrote about it in his extraordinary book, Homage to Catalonia, which was published during the war. actually didn't feel the way Hemingway did and felt he wanted to record what he saw as an honest picture of this discord he'd seen on the Republican side, even though it was not, by recording it, it was not being useful to the cause of the Republic to help it win the war. As soon as the war was over, Hemingway made clear that he really did have a quite capacious and subtle understanding of all of the factionalism on the Republican side and so on. And you can see this in his novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and you can see it in a couple of the short stories he wrote after the war was over. So they had sort of different philosophies about what a writer should do when faced with a situation like that. Interestingly, each of them admired the other's book a good deal. Orwell had high praise for Whom the Bell Tolls, and Hemingway for Homage to Catalonia. As far as we know, they only once met briefly in a hotel in Paris when they were both war correspondents in 1945. Whether they talked about Spain, we don't know. It's a conversation I would have loved to have listened in on it if it happened. Yeah.
Can we keep on this theme? What about Martha Gellhorn? Do you like her journalism? Was she put down because she was a woman? Was she less published, I guess, or less? Was she kept out of situations because she was a woman? Do you think she's a better reporter? Her stuff in China seems like, tons better than anything that I guess then husband Hemingway wrote about China when he's sort of in his sort of a drunken sprawl across Asia. I mean, what do you think about her work in Spain? Okay,
questions about what about Martha Gellhorn, who was with Hemingway in Spain on all of those trips that Hemingway made during the war. She was then his lover. Later, she became his third wife. She was a correspondent for Collier's magazine, which at that point, and as a former magazine editor, I have to say this with envy, had a circulation of 9 million. There's no magazine in the world, I think, that has that big a readership today. She wrote 3 pieces for Collier's and 1 for the New Yorker, I believe, when she was in Spain. And they are good pieces of reporting, although she too was at pains not to mention anything which could be seen as damaging the Republic's cause. I think it was hard to be a woman reporter at that time in a field where 95% of the foreign correspondents were men. But I think she did good work there. To my mind, however, the best English language journalist of any sort during the Spanish Civil War was neither Hemingway nor Gellhorn, but a woman named Virginia Cowles, who wrote first for the Hearst papers and then for the London Sunday Times, had a tremendous eye for detail, was determined to report the war both from the Republican side and from the nationalist side, which was extremely difficult to do because Franco and the nationalists didn't like to let in any reporter that they knew had covered the war from the other side, but she managed to get in. The best of her reporting, happily, is contained in a book of hers called Looking for Trouble, which was reissued recently and is still a wonderful read today. She was friends with Hemingway and Gellhorn, but I think her journalism from the war was better than either of theirs. Had a very shrewd eye, was the first journalist from anywhere to get nationalist officers to admit that they had bombed Guernica, the bombing that led to Picasso's famous painting, where for years Franco and Hitler maintained that Guernica had been blown up by retreating Republican troops, which was nonsense. So I would put her at the top of my list of journalists covering the war. Yeah.
I'm interested in how you choose your topics for your books, because I know that I read that King Leopold took a while to find a publisher, I think I'm correct, and the Spanish Civil War had been so much written about, so obviously you have some particular way of choosing your topic? And what's the next one?
Okay. Well, how do I choose my topics for the books? With difficulty, because it sometimes takes me a long time to feel that I've found the right pathway into a topic. There are lots of periods of history that interest me. The First World War has ever since I was a child. I had two uncles who fought in it. I heard them talk about it, but it took 20 years and several tries before I could finally figure out how to do it. And sometimes it's taken me, I hate to say it, as long as 3 years of thrashing around between finishing one book and figuring out what the next one's going to be. I try to stay off the streets and out of trouble by writing book reviews and magazine articles and keeping busy in other ways, but all the time I'm feeling desperately inside, I'm never going to find another subject like the last one. But sooner or later, it does seem to come along. Often it's after making several tries. You asked what I'm working on now. It's a book about some American radicals and dreamers in the period sort of 1905 to 1920 or so. But I spent the better part of a year barking up the wrong tree, thinking that what I was really interested in was a slightly earlier period in this country's life. And I did a lot of reading about it and prospecting for characters and trying to think how to assemble a book. And then I gradually realized, no, it's this later period, and I see who my characters are. But it's always hard, you know. It's like falling in love, because you have to really be in love with the subject if you're going to work 6 or 8 hours on it a day for 4, 5, 6 years, which is usually what it takes me. Then the book is done, the love affair is over, but you're still dreaming about her and thinking, I'm never going to meet somebody like her again, but then you do. Although it often takes a while.
I think we're running out of time. One last question.
Yeah, just one last question. Final question.
Yeah.
Could you talk a bit about your process for research? You know, how do you find these characters that you talked about early on? I mean, you must have to spend some time finding, you know, primary, secondary sources and such. Do you give yourself a cut-off point, or do you just keep on going?
Well, okay, so the question is, how do I find the characters I write about? Often I feel once I sort of have an idea of a general area, there are certain types of people I'm looking for. For example, once I had decided that I wanted to write something about the Spanish Civil War, and in particular, Americans in the Spanish Civil War. This is because it's the only time that 2,800 Americans have gone off to fight in somebody else's civil war. And as I mentioned, I knew a few of them. So who am I looking for? Because I was interested in, through my own experience, in how journalists cover an event, I knew I wanted to look for some American journalists to turn into characters. So I read every book I could find, and when I say read, I don't mean, you know, from every word, but, you know, skimming, I'll do a lot of skimming reading. Who are going to be the interesting American journalists to write about? Once I found Virginia Cowell's book and saw just how damn good it was, I thought, okay, she's in the story. And also the fact that she reported the war from both sides allowed me to use one of my characters to show what nationalist Spain looked like at this time. And having read her book, I then went and hunted up every article I could find that she'd written during that period, including a few that were not signed, but were have been identified by other people as being by her. Still looking for journalists, again, grazing around, looking at things. I realized that I had to include these two rival reporters from the New York Times. One on the Republican side, Herbert Matthews, who was in that piece I read you, and then he had another Times reporter named William Carney, who covered the war from the nationalist side. Each of them became absolutely intense backers of the particular side that they were covering. They hated each other. They found ways of sniping at each other in print very indirectly by, Matthews a couple of times found errors in Carney's story where Carney reported that the nationalists had captured a particular town. Matthews knew it was still in Republican hands, went there, wrote a dispatch from that town. And when you have a good rivalry like that, it always makes for good characters. I knew I wanted to write about some of the American volunteers. Happily, there are about 20 or so at least who have written published or unpublished memoirs. I looked through all of those. Where do I hear the most sound of a human voice? I wanted to show the variety of politics with which people come to this period. So one of the American volunteers, who is sort of a central character in the book, Robert Merriman, former graduate student at Berkeley, and in one letter, he describes the Morrison Library. And the leather chairs like a men's club, and what a luxurious place, and so on. He'd been a graduate student at Berkeley, and he and his wife, who also went to Spain, when they lived here during his graduate student days, lived 3 or 4 blocks from here near the corner of Euclid and Virginia Street. They left a lot of documentation. He was killed in the war, but she survived, wrote a book. There are letters back and forth between them. He kept a diary, and most of his diary survives. And they also exemplified something, which was that they were both ardent Communist Party members, true believers. I wanted other people who represented different points of view. There was one British guy. I let a few Brits into the cast of characters. One of them, by virtue of the fact that he fought in the American battalion almost the whole war. And when he was wounded, fell in love with an American nurse at the hospital, and their letters and diaries and so on there, which make great grist. And he was he was a radical, but not a communist. Felt the communists had no sense of humor, and he could never belong to a party that had no sense of humor, and they had the right answers to everything, and he couldn't stand that. Another character is an American journalist who was also, for a time, a volunteer, Louis Fisher, who was the Nation magazine correspondent in Russia for about 15 years, starting in 1920, had a very interesting political trajectory, which is that he started off as a true believing communist and then began to get disillusioned at the time of the Stalinist purges when they began, 1936. Just then the Spanish Civil War began. He jumped into it, volunteered for a time, then reported for the Nation from Spain. And so his disillusion with communism was going on as he was fighting during the Spanish Civil War. So that gave another political perspective on things. So I was kind of looking for people who represented different things, grazing around first in a lot of secondary literature, people who'd written other books about the war, got a lot of ideas. So I think the greatest English language historian of the war is an Englishman, Paul Preston, who's written many books on the subject. And one of his books was about press coverage of the Spanish Civil War. And that gave me a couple of leads, which I followed and led to characters. And then there's a very good archive in New York where a lot of Spanish Civil War veterans have left letters, diaries, and some unpublished memoirs. And I went looking through those unpublished memoirs. Are there any of these memoirs that really should have been published? And there's one of those that I quoted from a lot by a doctor who was in Spain. So different sources like that. So I guess that's it, huh? Time to stop. Well, thank you very much for coming, and thanks for inviting me.